Hi, welcome to the Agent Odyssey. My name is Matt Wyman, CEO and co-founder of Acario. Acario helps you stabilize your agents through simulation and monitoring. Today, I am really excited to have Neil Patel with us. Neil is the CEO and founder of a company called Vakya. Vakya provides voice agents in that long tail of languages. There's so many languages on this planet. There's so many more than just English. Neil, you've been in voice for many years. Tell us a little bit about what you're up to and how you're thinking about this market that you're engaged in.
Thank you so much, Matt. It's wonderful to be on here and looking forward to chatting about voice and multilingual and other things. Um, in terms of what we're seeing and what we're building, we recognize that voice is a now has become a really important channel or medium for communicating with any kind of AI system. And our thesis is that that's going to continue to be the case, and that voice may emerge as the default interface to AI systems in the future. I think a lot and talk a lot about with my team the film Her, and more it feels to me that that future is coming closer and closer to reality. So in that future, it's about a real time but always on ambient kind of experience, and really the most, I would say, from a human perspective, natural way that you can kind of stay in touch with that interface is voice. And so we think that that future is exciting, and yet there is an opportunity to contribute to that future from an inclusive space by making those experiences regionalized,
Hmm.
localized, and to add nuance culturally that make it a more engaging, usable, and ultimately more accessible kind of experience.
I think many people who are hearing this will resonate strongly with voice and the possibilities that exist amongst having conversations with AI. A lot of folks are still thinking about call centers, but it can show up everywhere else. There's so many other places. I love the fact that you use the word ambient, and I definitely want to come back to talk about ambient AI and how voice changes the sort of world that we live in. But maybe I also suspect people haven't spent as much time in thinking through the problems that happen when you want to serve local communities and languages and dialects. Can you maybe talk us through like how do you approach that as a from a product standpoint? Because it seems like you're massively expanding your edges and use cases and complications.
Yeah. So I think we start with the premise first and foremost that the quality of these voice experiences are driven by the degree to which we can engage, the level of engagement with these experiences. And you can measure engagement in multiple ways. The simplest thing is, for a given conversation, what is the sort of the quantity and the quality of those turns that you're taking with the interface. Um, and and what we've seen time and time again is that the degree to which the user is engaged with these systems is the degree to which they feel comfortable and connected, and ultimately trusting of that system. And trust, of course, has many dimensions. But in terms of making that engaging experience personalized and engaging, language, dialect, tonality, accent, emotion, these are very key dimensions to make that experience engaging and personalized. And I think personalized is maybe another lens to look at it. And I think one of the insights that we're operating under is that the frontier models, as large as they are, as many parameters as they have, there's only so many parameters that get saturated, and the predominant over 90% of the content on which these models are trained, and thereby these parameters get saturated, is in English. And so and that's just a function of many things, but amongst others, just the availability of multi-language training data. And so, just naturally, those parameters are going to be tuned or more optimized for English or other major languages than others. And so that doesn't mean that you can't use those same models for a long tail of languages. And of course, all of these models, companies and labs talk about the support for all of these different languages, what they do. But there's no way that you can support all of these languages to the same degree. And one of the things that you lose is that colloquialism, um, that familiarity, of that localization of a language. And so that's what we try to bring into that experience, building off of some of these really excellent frontier models.
It's interesting. Like even, I mean, there are turns of phrase that even don't translate across English speaking regions. With bases loaded, not everyone's a baseball fan. People may not understand what that means. So, how do you go about sort of bringing in all the more specific, the things that make it more comfortable, the things that make it actually feel localized to the languages? Do you have to go through and deliberately go through each one and retrain or post train these models? Like how do you think about that problem?
Yeah, it's exactly that. So the degree to which you can bring training data into the model development experience, ideally pre-trained, but absolutely fine-tuned and post-trained, to bring in the specific vocabularies, also the pronunciations, if you're talking about speech models, uh, and sort of like start to fine-tune according to these specific languages and dialects. You start to see that kind of that regionalization. So there's a big part of what we're trying to do around not just stitch and orchestrate together a voice app, but to really try to create a data pipeline or a feedback loop where the conversations that we're having are feeding back into a training data set that reflects back what kind of language experience the end users are what kind of language they're speaking, what kind of experience that they want to have. And so um yeah, I think it's there's a feedback loop, and also um there is whatever tuning that we can do from a prompting and sort of context perspective, to bring in those vocabularies.
Intentional bias, right? To lean it towards a particular set of phrases and manners of speech. So, I mean, I think this is, I don't want to go too deep onto the technical side. I think it's fascinating though, the amount of effort. I mean, it takes more effort to go build, these more regional voices. But then when you go take them to market, um, I'm curious, who are generally speaking, who do you see as the buyers who bring those types of agents to market? Since you're providing a platform to go build these agents, who are your buyers?
So I think, of course, the simple answer is the buyer who is interested in supporting a wider range of languages better. But I think, if we take it one step deeper or further, it's really any buyer of voice experiences who believes that a key unlock of these voice experiences is personalization. Because all of these aspects that we've discussed, uh, you know, tone, accent, even dialect, they apply to English as much as they apply to any other language. And so what we see is ultimately what we're trying to build is these personalized voice experiences, and that applies to any language. We believe that in terms of like a market entry standpoint, there is just less of I think less of attention being paid to the longer tail of languages. But ultimately, what we feel we're building is an engine to really spin up these localized, regionalized voice experiences very quickly and very cost effectively. And so then you can imagine applying that to a very individualized or personalized basis. Where, for example, in the States, hey, you have someone who's interacting in a Southern accent for someone who's from a coast. And it's not necessarily that a Southern person only wants to interact with a Southerner. It's the idea that these voice experiences fit your preferences and what you're comfortable with from an engagement perspective. So I think it's the widest possible market.
Yeah, and I think that that makes sense to me. I've had this theory for quite a while. This I do call it a hypothesis that we're because of AI, because of the pace, but also the nature of how it can fit into corners, edges, and fill spaces that were otherwise glossed over or ignored when people were having to write code by hand, which sounds so anachronistic now. It means that we can use new products and build new products that would appeal to a set of communities that would otherwise not be served. And that whether it's a bank, an insurance company, like larger entities can actually expand more effectively and provide a better product in each of these different niche areas, but also means individual entrepreneurs can go build a product for one of these niche areas because they can specialize in a community. However you define community, it could be a community by language, community by space, community by interest. um, so as people are using Vakya, are you seeing more of the larger enterprises that are trying to gain more coverage across different communities? Or are you seeing people come in and say, no, I need a voice agent to solve this very bounded problem for someone speaking a very regional language or dialect? Where do you see that traction coming from?
Yeah, I think that generally speaking, what I'm seeing, and maybe this is a controversial perspective, is that people are assuming that the frontier models just cover everything at the frontier level, and that whatever we're getting from the best of the best models is the best we can do for any given language. So that level of language specialization, I think, is relatively lacking. Now, there are initiatives in different regions and countries around the world where they're building sovereign models, and they're starting with local language data. Certainly, I work extensively in India, and that's happening there, and also in Europe and South America, these initiatives are happening. But these models, of course, are quite behind in many respects from the frontier labs. Maybe they'll catch up, maybe they'll not. But the majority of voice AI application builders in this space that I see today are working off of this common model and saying, hey, whatever languages these models support, we support them. And I think that the challenge there is that these models don't equally support all of these languages, as we've discussed. Like it just like in terms of the sort of the multilingual latent space in these models, if you're biased towards English, most of your training data is in English. The everything that is going to be outputted from that model in another language is being filtered through these neurons that are English dominant. And so you really do have to specialize in creating specific language dominant neurons to really make it feel like a human natively speaking in that language. Otherwise, it's always going to feel like a stiff translation. And so I think that it's not happening enough. Certainly, I think that's where things are moving as we see, generally speaking, a recognition that the future includes a mix of like very large frontier models and then also smaller niche specifics, language specific or domain specific models. And I think, and we maybe can talk about we can get into, without getting too technical, the architecture, but somehow it's going to be some combination of these things.
Well, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I would love to talk about the business side of it and understand who's adopting. So when you make these various languages available, when you make it possible to have ambient AI that can understand local dialects and respond in kind, so to speak, to the people who are actually in the space and in that experience, who are you seeing as the first movers to adopt that more localized AI experience?
I think that it's really those companies who are sort of default global multinational organizations. We work extensively in financial services. These are large banks and other financial institutions that serve populations across, and their operations are set up so that they reflect this regionality. So, for example, a bank who serves global audiences would have call centers in those local regions that they're targeting, where the call center workers are speaking that local vernacular. So these sorts of like multi-language serving organizations are going to be the first to take up these multi-language supporting agent capabilities. And right now, what mainly happens is they probably do an ensemble approach where they pick the best English provider, the best French provider, the best Spanish provider, and they're doing it by committee. And of course, that has certain disadvantages from enterprise efficiency perspective. Context is hard to get shared across, and you're managing and juggling multiple integrations. So what really is needed is a solution that is unified enough that there's shared context and there's economies of scale. At the same time, it has it down at the node level, speaking with interacting with actual customers, it has that very, very deep degree of localization and regionalization. I think that's pretty much missing so far.
It's definitely missing. I think part of what I'm and have been trying to figure out is how much expectation the business is going to put on the consumer to adapt to the business versus the other way around, the business
Yeah.
to adapt to the consumer. And I think this has been the case for a long time, right? And in many dimensions, we've expected consumers to adapt to the business. It's been um,
Yes.
I'd say it's been unbalanced in that manner. And so when I see, and when we originally, when originally met you and whatnot, I was very excited because this potentially tips that scale the other direction again. It says, okay, no, wait, we should meet consumers where they are, not the reverse. And again, these are easy things to say, especially in markets where there's a lot of homogeneity. But when it's not a homogeneous market and you have all sorts of different concerns and needs, it becomes harder. So you're
Absolutely.
seeing financial service institutions, you're seeing like large enterprises that are trying to meet consumers a little bit more where they are. Um, do you see, is this still largely call center, or are they also trying to now create more unique experiences?
I think it's so that's a really important question because and going back to your last point, the whole promise I think of AI from an enterprise or business perspective is that we can put the customer first, put the consumer first, and tailor experience around each individual customer. I recently saw someone at the AI's World Fair talk about websites that when you go to the website, it dynamically spins up a version of that website that is personalized to that individual website visitor, which till this point has not happened. And I think this is a page, borrowing a page out of the book of voice systems, where you do have this ability to, like, each and every conversation, each and every sentence and turn in the conversation, you can really go deep into personalizing. And so this to me is ultimately the really unique and exciting opportunity of AI. Um, and then I guess coming to your question, call center is the starting point for most of these large enterprises to think about automating their customer experience because it's a very painful part of their operations in many, many ways. It's expensive. It's very difficult to hire, train, and retain these call center workers. And if you've ever been in these call centers, then of course, all of us have interacted with them. It's a pretty soul crushing job. I think
It
most
is,
people
yeah.
do not aspire to be a call center worker. In many ways, it's quite inhumane. They're humans that are actually kind of being asked to work like a robot, right? Read off a script. So it's very natural for enterprises to say this is not like necessarily like a desirable situation for all sides, and we can come up with a net better solution by automating it if the agent experience is great. So you start with the call center, but I think, and you automate the existing conversations and scripts that are happening there. That's like the very simple, skeuomorphic kind of step. The next step is to think about, hey, I have this now new capability where I can scale my interaction capability up and down with a button click. I no longer have to keep like this staff of workers. It has infinite learning capability, never gets tired, never gets exhausted, never gets upset when these agents get insulted, can speak every language. So I can actually now rethink the entire customer experience. These are I think the winning that's the winning mindset and mentality in terms of reimagining the customer experience around these new capabilities. So that means that In the context, for example, of financial services, one of the most common kinds of conversations that the institution wants to have with their customer is when that customer goes delinquent, right?
Hmm.
A recovery call. Usually, that in the past, that has been the first time, oftentimes, that the customer hears from the bank is, "Hey, you're late on
Well,
your fee," you know? Up until then, you probably haven't heard from them. But now you go delinquent, it's a problem. So you get a call. And of course, that's like a real position of weakness. Like you don't know who that customer is. You have no context, you have no rapport, you have no trust. And so it leads to this sort of situation where it's a kind of an adversarial kind of conversation to whatever extent. Contrast that with, you have now the ability to touch that customer way before that point of delinquency, even including from the time they become your customer, from the time the loan, for example, is dispersed. You can, hey, congratulations or welcome to the bank, or let me walk you through the features and benefits of this financial product. And you can keep touching that customer throughout the life cycle of that product. So that at the time of delinquency, it's no longer as adversarial. There is some kind of rapport that's built up. And prior to this technology, you really didn't have the ability to do that because there's just too many phone calls. You can't, you know, you can't afford to do that with your humans. And so that to me is an example of like creating these magic moments where you can really touch the customer in a different way that the customer also appreciates. So no longer do you feel like it's spam. And really that's kind of like the ultimate thing that we're trying to, change the narrative around, is to say that can we make these calls actually useful to all of us? All of us have these call center nightmares where we hate to call it, call the call center or get a call. I think there's a real opportunity to make those delightful experiences.
I have to imagine they would also need to have more educational content, and
Yes.
the entire process needs to work differently because you don't have, the massive body of Western languages and content that's out in the world to go borrow from to learn about how loans work, how delinquency works, how, all the little um, nitty gritty information you can go learn from. So I'm assuming it's there's still resources, but the resource pool is smaller, which is entirely why this exists to begin with. And so maybe, again, hypothesis, maybe it's actually even better to have that multi-touch, and that's necessary to actually work effectively in those markets. So it's not just trying to offset a human labor problem, which actually isn't a problem, but rather trying to figure out a better way to help the people who are in those communities. And maybe there's a different kind of product that's needed to actually satisfy it. Do you see that kind of intent coming from your customers? I mean, how are they approaching this regionalization? Are they approaching it with that sort of consumer first mentality, or is it still, and I'm not even sure this is a bad thing, but is it still just trying to figure out how do we make this many phone calls in a week because it's hard? Uh,
So I think it's a little bit of both. Now, especially in kind of emerging markets globally, oftentimes your service is competing against like a very low bar of service, right? Like sometimes financial services are not even available. And so anything that you can provide that customer, they're probably better off, right? So um, in that sense, it is kind of a human labor problem because in emerging markets, you have to make up for low ARPU with high scale. And so you always have to think about your systems being able to scale. And so that's where I think there's a natural kind of adoption of these technologies in places like we work, like in Mexico and India and Philippines, where that scale is just inherently part of your business model, and you have to think like that from the beginning. Now that said, I think there is an opportunity to differentiate your solution or your product, and I think my financial services, fintechs in particular, are recognizing that through the customer experience. And if you can deliver something that is actually you actually benefit from hearing from your bank, or that you feel like your problems are getting resolved, your issues are being heard and getting actually rectified effectively, then it it's a win-win. You know, you can build customer loyalty and you can build trust. And if you're shifting the kind of labor, the expensive labor pool from like the routine or more mundane kinds of conversations to
More
and letting
impactful
them do
ones.
the more substantive conversations that are highly escalated. That ultimately again allows you to serve more customers better. So I think that's a win. And of course, these agent experiences are able to solve or address more and more complex conversations, which even adds more sort of benefit value that's created for both the customer and for the business.
Yeah, I just see, especially a couple years ago, and I've seen less of it right now, but there was this initial wave of cost oriented um, value sort of applied to AI, like, oh, we can save
Yes,
costs by bringing in AI. But I think more and more what we're seeing is, and it's not that surprising. AI can help fill the sort of the edges, the cracks, the rest of the tapestry, so you can actually provide a better consumer experience, exactly as you're describing, right? And there are many areas that are not being addressed that we can actually start to address, and that kind of lifts the entire experience up. So
exactly.
loyalty is amazing. If you have a great experience with a particular bank, you're going to tell your friends, you're going to tell your family, you're going to tell other people. And also, if you can reduce the friction, the bank actually probably runs more smoothly if it's not having to do as many collections just because they made a phone call 2 weeks before or a month before. They may not have been able to make that phone call previously, but if they can just reduce the overall friction, you can see a systemic improvement.
Exactly.
And I want to come back to the ambient. Let's speculate for a moment. Let's jump like 5 years. I don't know, maybe more. Let's jump 10 years into the future. Um, how do you see voice, language, and ambient AI um, changing? Do you see more devices? Do you see people talking devices more often? What about privacy? Well, what's your vision?
I do. I see. So good questions. I think we're already kind of seeing it with like these what's the term like in offices now in Silicon Valley at least there's like is it called the talk sock or something that you're putting over your face to, to talk to talk to your computer to like to write and you're writing software by speaking to Claude. So we're already seeing those companies that are living in the near future adopting this idea of like just speaking to your devices, and it's starting with your laptop. What I can very readily see is that extrapolated to talking to any kind of object. Internet of to me that the convergence of Internet of Things and AI is where voice I think will reside. So talking to your fridge, talking to your plant vase to ask it if your plant is getting enough fertilizer, water, is the ratio enough or okay. Um, and it's just a very efficient means of communication in certain contexts. And so yes, I think that we'll be kind of mumbling to each other and to our devices uh, a lot more. That will open up these questions of like, yeah, like privacy and how do we create the spaces for us to have those conversations if they become intimate or sensitive. And I think that our physical spaces will certainly adapt around that, you know?
You can
Like,
imagine the cone that comes down. Wasn't that there was an old TV show where the cone of silence would come down so people could speak inside the cone. But no, I think it makes sense. I think it also drives into the regionalization. uh, the more we get into the environment, the more you get nuances and you get different. Even within populations, there are phrases, turns of phrases, dialects that all will become important, not just to understand,
yeah.
but you should expect it to come back the other way. And they're not being there's very little attention being given to that. I think broadly right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And coming back to our original conversation or earlier conversation, language is not a static thing. It's a living, breathing thing that is constantly evolving. So there's also, there is a language like English, there's a language like Hindi, but then there's also a language called Hinglish, which is a mixed language, which is a combination. And these two languages are constantly converging and diverging. And oh, by the way, every language, it's like, an n squared problem, or even like an n factorial problem, because combinations of languages also converge and diverge. And so that what you hit on is, coming back to that conversation of feedback loop, as language evolves, you want your AI systems to also evolve with that, right? And so that's, taking in those conversations, feeding them back in, continuing to update the parameters, take in Gen Z slang. So like, that's going to continue to evolve. And you don't want to like keep programming that in every 6 months or 1 month or whatever. You want that to evolve as the language evolves. So yeah, I think these in the future, I imagine that these devices will also be consistently upgrading and creating these loops to be able to keep up.
In many ways, the web, quote unquote, created a more homogenous sort of language and culture globally. But I think AI coming through is going to do the reverse. I think
Yeah,
it's going to allow us to actually become and see in a good way, um, and get that regionalism back and get our sort of
yeah.
the culture influence
And,
back.
and
Um, hmm,
sorry, on that last point, the other thing that's going to influence language is not just other humans, but the AI systems themselves. So one interesting thing that we've noticed is, early in the early days of these voice AI systems, you did have a lot of issues with latency, and even now, latency is a big issue. I mean, you work in this space as well. It's not a fully solved problem, but turn taking has become really, really good. There's still a lot of innovation happening there, but what we noticed is when if the agent is conversationally, trustworthy, competent, and delivering real value to the customer. We do this also as human to human conversation, but essentially we see that the human, if the latency is higher, the human adjusts their prosody to the agent because they're getting some value out of it. And we do that as well. Like, it's not like everyone is speaking at the cadence or speed that we all prefer, but we adjust our turn taking according to that. And so that's also happening with these AI agents. And so there's also going to be part of this feedback loop is the agents themselves, how we communicate to them is going to definitely impact language. And that's an additional element beyond just like the Hindi and English. It's like Hindi, English, and you know transformer. It's the weights that are also going to interact.
and let's also remember emotion and sort of momentum in a conversation. These things are real, and we expect them to be reflected. We reflect them back to our speaking partner, and they reflect it back to us. And we're just starting to see various teams go through and start to add that into their voice agents. So Neil, I always like to sort of end the podcast on a set of questions around the future and how people have to adjust. As you're thinking about the future, what are the skill sets, and I don't mean just in engineering, just generally everywhere, are there new skills that people need to embrace and adopt as they get ready for this new world of AI and language all around us?
It's a great question, and I'm sure all kind of builders in the space think about this question a lot. I'll share maybe what's like top of mind because it's continuously evolving. But I think like one of the most important skills of the future is, and these are not new skills. I think these are kind of coming back to the basics. Is some maybe the way I can just call it is agency. Uh, Having a real clarity of intent. When we're in the future where there is the cost of intelligence is basically zero, and you can point it towards whatever you want. The premium is in where you point it, you know, and what you're asking it to do, and what impact per token are you able to generate. And so, without your own clarity of intent and agency and decision making, maybe these are some other terms that maybe are around this idea. Um, you won't be able to marshal those tokens in the most impactful, efficient, best way. Um, and so I think, and I think yeah, I think that that's something that I think about as a general um, sort of guiding post to say, hey, am I clear in what I want? Am I clear in what I think is good for the world? And if I'm clear in that thought, if I understand the problem I'm solving or the problem I'm addressing as clearly as possible, I'm going to be best suited to solve the problem. The solution itself is going to be deeply guided by these, by this cheap intelligence. And so it's about marshaling that in the best possible way.
That resonates really strongly with me. I still see, people will be new to Claude or various co-pilots, and then I'll have a conversation, and quite often, early days, the conversation is, there's all this talk about it, but it doesn't work that well for me. And then we get into the weeds of like, well, what did you actually do? What did you ask? And it turns out quite often it's people asking for extremely narrow task completion as though it were their right hand. They're treating it as though it were an extension of themselves to go do a very narrow task. I'm like, and so then the conversation goes to, well, have you tried to back up a step and articulate what it is you're trying to get done, which is exactly what you're talking about, right? That clarity of thought. This is what I'm trying to get done. Then give it, identify that agency that's needed so that you can actually go and build up from ground. I'm going to call it ground truth, but it's shared principles. Like, these are the core principles that you're going to approach this problem with, but it
Hmm.
takes trust. So I'm
Hmm.
curious, do you see agency as requiring people to also expand their trust? Because if you're going to be clear in your thought about what you're trying to accomplish, and you even said it yourself, you're turning over a lot of the work itself to this agent, to this AI, and that requires trust. So how do you see that relationship?
Well, great question, and I'll answer it a couple ways. But first, I would say that trust is also can also be a function of verifiability, and I'll plug Ocario.
Mm.
I think
Thank you.
the future the future of evaluation, verifiability, authentication, all of these kinds of what we think of as maybe side services become way more important in the future, where we're not reading every line of code or we're not reviewing every line of text that's generated. So some kind of verification is critical. And I think another thought I had to what you were saying is trust also comes through that clarity of intent. And a word that comes to mind as you were sharing was values.
Mm.
People people having a strong sense of values, people cultivating the values that are important to them, and people living by those values, people practicing those values. I think in all of our lives, we can probably think of examples of people who were like, that person is totally aligned with the principles. You mentioned the word principles, with the principles by which they walk the talk. And I think that that's where trust starts, and that's where humans are going to continue to be very important. Where the humans who are marshaling a huge amount of tokens, we ultimately have to vest our trust in the human. And so, what are their values? What values are being amplified through the tokens that they're marshaling? And so, that becomes extremely important.
This resonates strongly. I love the agency. I love the concept of clarity of thought and agency as the skill that everyone needs to work on. I think you're 100% right that people end up in these tiny sort of cul-de-sacs and not looking up and thinking about the larger world and the values that they have. Neil, this has been a great conversation today. Thank you so much for joining.
It's been wonderful, Matt. I appreciate your time, and it was really fun.